Okay, I just read Laterras Whitfield's Student of Love, Your Guide to Discover, Uncover, and Recover Healthy Relationships. And in case you don't know, Laterras Whitfield is the host of the Dear Future Wifey podcast, which he has been hosting since 2020. So I received the book on Kindle. I bought it, pre-ordered it sometime last year, and I was just curious about what was being said in the book and if there's anything new I could learn. And so when I received it in my Kindle on release day, which is this past Tuesday, I proceeded to go ahead and read a bit of it in snatches each day until I finished on Saturday, which is today, the time of this recording. And I wanted to just give my honest critique. I am currently by trade a speech language pathologist, and I work with primarily Generation Alpha today. But historically, I was a college English professor to students from the generations Baby Boomer, Gen X, Millennial, which is my generation, and Gen Z. So I know I look pretty young to have taught those students, but I taught those students after having earned my English bachelor's and master's. So from that point of view, I wanted to offer my honest critique of this particular book. And what I want to do first is start off with the positives. Okay, so positive number one was that the Terrace brings up topics important in dating today. So we're talking about friend zones. I thought that was a pretty interesting topic that he hit on. Being in the friend zone. Anybody experienced that? I know I've experienced that before, and I put people in the friend zone myself historically. And looking at the possibility of having that evolve, over time into something more. Okay, emotional intelligence. I think that is highly important in a relationship. Extremely, extremely important. So I really appreciated that he brought in emotional intelligence as one of his talking points. Let's see. So then he is talking about discerning who is really for you and who is not for you. So he termed it options versus opportunities. Opportunities can get you distracted, but options are better. And he has his specific reasons for, why you should choose one over the other. And I appreciate how he gives that argument. And also, he talks about authenticity, and that's amongst other topics. So, these are some topics that I'm just coming up with off the top of my head that I remember, and I thought he did a pretty good job talking about each of those topics amongst some other topics in his book. Okay, another positive is he tends to use credible sources when he is supporting his claims. Whenever he decides to support his claims, he brings in examples from his podcast, Dear Future Wifey, the episodes that are relevant, things that were said, whether it was couples or someone who was single, he brings in relevant points when necessary. Okay, also he uses research, which I, as a former professor, I really appreciate that because when I had my students write their essays and they had to make their case for anything, I always expected some research to be put in there. If they did not have research brought in there in some shape, form, or fashion, their grades on my papers were not, or my assignments rather, were not going to be good grades. So I very much appreciated seeing research. And also, he brought in biblical stories. And I love seeing concepts from the Bible brought up, principles from the Bible brought up, stories from the Bible brought up. That was beautiful. And of course, he brought in his own experiences and some analogies that a few people could relate to. Well, that actually a multitude of people could relate to. So I really did appreciate how he supported the claims in that way when he supported his claims. Okay, another positive is that he dives into a perspective that is not explored very often when it comes to romance, and that includes friendship. So I did mention that a little bit, but I'm going to hit on this a little bit more at this point. He has the same moving from friend to fiance, and that was his own dream. So he explores this a bit more. And the whole concept of friendship and how a lot of times it's frowned upon in society because you look at it as a friend as, oh, that's just my friend. That's not really somebody I could ever be in love with one day. And he talks about, hey, you might want to consider and look again. It just depended on the person and, if your values align and whatnot. And making important points about comfort. Your friend makes you feel more comfortable, whereas you jump into something with a person who, that's your lover right off. If they give you a piece of critique, you're more likely to, recoil in horror or, be offended or whatnot. But if a friend gives you a piece of critique because that is your friend and you feel comfortable with that person, you feel like your most authentic self with that person, then you're more likely to listen to that friend and take that feedback. So then that can lead to, if it's meant to be, if you're compatible in a romantic sense, you can move on into a relationship where you can work as true partners, and there's not all this tension that would be the case in the event that, for instance, you just entered your relationship and you were just lovers and not friends before. So I thought he did a great case for that and presented that very well. I really appreciated him tackling that particular topic, that subject that is not talked about enough, I think. So he did good with that. The other part he did was he gives action items at different points throughout the book, and he a lot of I would consider self-discovery assignments, tasks that he gives to the reader, which I appreciated that. So the person who's really intentional about moving forward will become a better like a student of love, as he says. If they want to make themselves more appealing to their future partner, right, their future spouse, there are things they have to undergo themselves, questions they have to ask themselves, things they have to unpack about themselves. And so the more they learn about themselves, the more comfortable they can get about themselves, and then, hey, they attract the partner of their dreams. So I really do appreciate that he does that as well. And at the end of each chapter, he leaves a summary of important points for every chapter, and that section is called the Love Lab. And so it's just these nuggets, just again highlighting main points from different chapters in his book. And so I thought he did very well with that as well. Okay, so with that stated, I want to go to the sections of the book that I was not as pleased with. So I'm going to go back. And so one of them was use of crude language. And so when I looked up the word crude, it refers to sexually explicit language. And so I was kind of surprised because with the use of the Bible here, I'm thinking, okay, he's really wanted to, bring out the Christ element and the God element here. He really wants to do that. But I was very shocked, even the very first chapter, he was making a sexual reference, and it was to oral sex in particular. And I saw in the parentheses, when I was reading ahead above, and my eye went down a little prematurely, and it went down to a parenthetical. If you're not certain of what a parenthetical is, it's words inside of parentheses. And so for me, I typically write in parentheticals when I write out long pieces of, I have long pieces of writing. I can't help myself. So my eye, if I see somebody else using a parenthetical, my eye draws to that parenthetical. And I remember the parenthetical stated in his book in that first chapter, get your mind straight. And I was like, what is he talking about? And I looked immediately right before, and I saw the term for oral sex. And I was shocked by that. I was really thrown off. And then I looked at the term before that, and he was trying to name one of the 8 forms of love, I think established by the Greeks. And I think that term was philassia. And I had to look it up, right? Philassia. And he said not to be mistaken for, I don't speak this way, so I'm not going to say it, but you probably can put 2 and 2 together. And so I was taken aback by that. And before someone comes along and say, that's somebody just joking along and stuff like that, my view is like, you're trying to put this out as a Christian author. And I know no one is perfect. None of us is perfect. I'm not perfect, right? My view is like, it seems like an appeal to the world here. I don't know. And maybe that's his everyday life when he's with friends, with his wife or whoever, and they're totally okay with it. Okay, that's fine, but this is an audience. You're trying to present this story out to the world. And so I'm not going to lie. After that, I was kind of just side-eyeing some of the content because I'm thinking, is this going to pop up again? For me, it was personally disturbing. I didn't think it was necessary, and it didn't even fit in the book, because I'm like, why are we talking about something using sexually explicit language here? Like, that doesn't make sense. And it also made me think, like, he's telling the reader to get your mind straight, which leads me to the next point about using a condescending tone at times to the reader. And again, someone might say, oh, he's just joking. Now, again, If he does that with his wife, his close friends, that's fine. But this is an audience who they probably don't even get your humor like that. And I know he's been going on a interview, like a book tour recently across these different platforms. And so he's wanting more people outside his basic audience, his Dear Future Wifey audience, to read the book. And I totally get that. There's nothing wrong with that. But it seems like the use of that type of language doesn't consider that some people, maybe who knows how many of those people from those various audiences of those platforms who get the book probably would not appreciate that language in a book. For me, I didn't find it charming. I didn't find it funny. It made me not trust him as much as the author at that point, because I was just wondering why it was there. It could have been taken out, honestly. It honestly could have been taken out. And there's 3 other times in the book where there was some crude language that I didn't think was necessary, and it could have been taken out. And he still would have held his voice, because I know he wants to use his unique voice within his book. And even if you took those pieces out, that crude language out, his voice would still be there. So I wouldn't see any problem with him removing that language, and his voice would still stay throughout the book, and be presented as he wants to be presented. And I'm considering, he again maybe think I'm just joking along with folks, but you can have fun in a book, and not at the expense of your reader. Okay, remember, you're on a common mission here. You're trying to teach them something very important, teaching them about love based on your experiences, and then experiences of people who've been on your podcast, and people who, and also from research as well. So I just found some of the condescending language just a bit disturbing, and I think one of them I'm going to bring up here. So he was talking about at one point about people facing peer pressure, and you're worried about talking to your potential partner and worrying about if they're going to like you or not, and how you should be okay with being yourself and not having to worry. And he had this part in the book, and he said, and this is precisely where people, namely lovers, get into trouble. They believe their individual identities have to match those around them. If you're a middle schooler, we call this peer pressure. If you're an adult with a job, we just call this stupid. Don't be stupid. So again, he made his mind just be joking, and that's his humor. But this is his book debut in the world out here today. I didn't find that part funny. I'm certain there were other readers who have read it, didn't find it funny. We could have done without that language. How are you really going to adequately teach the audience if you're being condescending toward them in that way? And there were some other times he was like that too, that I found, off-putting, and it made me not take in what he wanted to, promote and teach. It allowed me to absorb it as well as I could have had that language not been there. Okay. So something else I noted that was a bit off to me was that he seems to be talking to more than one audience. So I noticed this in 2 different ways. In one way, it seemed like he was broken between talking to a worldly audience versus a Christian audience, with all the use of biblical references and scripture throughout. At one point I'm thinking, oh, okay, so his audience is really Christian, and that's what he's really aiming for. But on the flip side, when he's using that condescending language and the sexually explicit language, which I don't consider any of that Christ-like, then it seems like he's trying to appeal to a worldly audience. So I was confused about who he was trying to appeal to. And then there was times when he was referring to the universe. For instance, he mentioned, radical acceptance taught me that rejection isn't the universe slamming the door on your dreams. It's the universe saying, hold up, I've got something better in mind, but let's be real. To see it that way, you need emotional intelligence. So I appreciated he went into, after this, a discussion about emotional intelligence, but it was the use of the universe as opposed to God, because he had been leading up to this point, already talking about God, and then he switched over to the universe. So I was like, who exactly are you talking to? Are you talking to believers or non-believers, or are you trying to meet people halfway? But either way, I was thrown off as the reader. Okay, another time when I noticed he seemed like he was talking to 2 audiences is when he had a chapter that was saying, marry young, build strong. I think that was the name of the chapter. It was chapter 11 in his book. and he had a whole case about marrying young. Now, he didn't specify what young meant, but I'm assuming it was in the 20s because he did bring in reference from one of his Dear Future Wifey podcast episodes with Jason Wilson and his wife. And I'm familiar with Jason Wilson, who is a proponent for, men being accountable and being the best version of themselves, the best godly versions of themselves they can be. So I love Jason Wilson content. I do recall his story and him saying he and his wife married in their 20s, and they have built themselves up from there as a couple, and it's a beautiful love story. I mean, it's not perfect. They've told their love story, and it wasn't all pleasant, right? And that's a lot of love stories, right? And so he had a chapter where he was talking about the young people and the benefits of marrying young, and I was kind of confused. I'm like, I didn't feel like most of his audience were people like in their 20s, the young crew, if that's what he deemed as young. I wasn't sure what he necessarily deemed as young. But then there was this young versus older love, and like if you're older, you're always set in your ways, and you're not open to seeing things differently, and you're just stuck at, and when you're in love, you're not rigid and things like that. And I remember reading some of that content and making a note that, hey, I know of people who marry young, and they act like they are rigid in their ways today. Like, I mean, there was a note I made in the book and Kindle. It was like, yeah, they act like they move with heartbreak and cynicism daily. Have you anybody been on the job and faced one of the mean girls, and she's an older lady? Okay, so I'm just saying, I faced that before, and that particular woman, more times than not, that people like to admit, she was a woman that married young, and for whatever reason, she's highly bitter today. And that's not every woman, but I've seen that enough times. So I don't know, it just kind of threw that off for me, about the younger versus older audience. And if that was the case, if you were trying to also appeal to the older audience, you've offended them in that chapter. So I couldn't quite get who his audience was. Okay. Also, there was this oversimplification of divorce. That part very much disturbed me because I am a divorcee. And another thing, I honestly thought he was going to go all in and just do, that this was going to be the chapter that he did very well with. So I was disappointed when it kind of came out for me as lazy and just simplistic. And he used this language at one point like, yep, I was a marriage dropout, not expelled, not suspended. I willingly chose to walk away by filing for divorce. Some of y'all are marriage dropouts too. Divorce wasn't some accidental slip up. It got too hard, too challenging, and you said forget it. Then you had the nerve to enroll in a different school when it suited you. So I had to sit with that for a minute. I was like, I had to go read it again, see what it again, read it again, see what again, a few times, because I don't like to just give responses, and my initial feeling was frustration, and I didn't want to give a response off of that. But having sat with it for a while and reread it, I feel like this was a strong oversimplification of divorce. Now, his case, and interest, it seemed like a projection and a deflection on his part. Now, he was the one that ended his marriage after he cheated on his wife. I'm not shaming him for that. He's already been open and honest about that, so I appreciate that openness and honesty. But to kind of almost like turn around and be like, well, those of you who divorced, y'all did the same thing that I did because it was too hard and too challenging, too tough. You just gave up too. No, to be clear, in my particular case, I know, and I was in a relationship with somebody that I did not even consult with the Lord about in the first place. And so, yes, it turned into something terrible in the end, to the point that my ex-husband was mistreating me so badly, I was contemplating ending my life. And the Lord even confirmed in my spirit, in my heart one day. He's like, if you stay with this man, because again, God wasn't a part of my marriage to this man. I did not ask God to come in to be a part of that marriage. But he confirmed it to me. He said, if you stay with this man in the new year, because this was 2021, when all these thoughts of ending my life were coming into my head, he's like, if you stay with him in 2022, you're going to end your life. So I had to leave to save my life. So what he's talking about here, when he's oversimplified divorce in that way, and what I had to endure, two totally different things. So I didn't appreciate that oversimplification. Also, there are people who are being unalived in their marriages, who stayed in marriages where the one partner was terribly mistreating the other one. And unfortunately, it resulted long term. Maybe they had a desire to leave, but they didn't feel like they could. And then the partner unalived them, and sometimes they unalived them and themselves. So if that person wanted to leave the marriage and actually live for their life, you mean they was just a dropout too because it was just too hard and too tough? That doesn't make sense. So this chapter for me, I could not really take in, and this was chapter 4. I couldn't really take in anything he was saying in this chapter. He had a beautiful part in when he talked about the story of Joseph that was not pertaining to divorce or anything like that later on in this chapter. But because of this one part alone, I just couldn't take him seriously. I could not take this chapter seriously. So I would highly encourage him to go back and rewrite that and not oversimplify it, because that was highly offensive to divorcees like myself. I don't know about other divorcees and what their experience is, but I was like, they don't even line up. And and I'm not the only one who's coming out of marriage where my spouse mistreated me terribly and almost like relished in doing that. So we know that's not love, okay? And trust me, I learned my lesson about choosing the wrong person. I learned my lesson. Okay. And the last point I want to make about what he did was he seemed like he had several moments of deflecting or making assumptions about the reader that I thought was very interesting, and it was kind of off-putting. So it was like he would admit something about divorcing his spouse, or being the person who initiated his divorce, but then he would go back and deflect onto the reader, whoever he was talking to in this particular moment, in this negative way, as if he couldn't just sit with the fact that he had just mentioned that, yes, I've done wrong in my marriage. I was guilty of being unfaithful in my marriage. He wouldn't just let that sit. So a good example of this is, look, I'll admit that I wasn't perfect in my marriage, but one thing about me, I don't expect to get paid for doing nothing. Yet some of y'all quiet quit your relationships every day, showing up but not really putting in the work. So he'll admit, like, okay, yeah, I know I didn't do everything right, but then y'all do this. Y'all can't do this right. I was just thrown off with that. I'm like, why are you talking to your reader like that? And later on he does say, I'm here to help, but I'm like, after you've insulted people, and again, in his mind, he may be thinking he being lighthearted. I don't know what the intention was of doing that, but I wasn't feeling it when I saw that. I was thinking, like, wow, this is a high oversimplification. And it was very unfortunate. I was very, surprised by that and disappointed by that. And so there were some other points where he seemed to be deflecting, even if he brought up something about him being, for instance, that marriage dropout section I read, the one about the divorce. Yeah, I dropped out my marriage, but y'all did too, because it was too hard and too challenging. I'm like, please no, sir. You sitting that yourself. That's what you did. That's not what I did. So please just work on not doing things that's going to offend your reader, especially your reader who's genuinely there to learn something new. And that's what I'm there for. I'm just here to learn something new, see if there's something I haven't heard before, and there's nothing wrong with that. So, okay. Yeah. So I saw that, and then my other point that I wanted to make was that he said on one of the chapters, which I thought was very important, because it was ironic given what I've just said here. So listen to this. He said, we often project our own experiences and opinions as absolute facts, neglecting the reality of someone else's journey. Sometimes we reach conclusions about others even though we've never had to face their challenges ourselves. Worse yet, we don't even attempt to judge fairly. Instead, we leap to decisions based on allegations and preconceptions rather than evidence. And even when evidence is present, we fail to extend hearts of love and compassion toward another fellow human. And I wrote a note, because in Kindle they allow you to make a note. You can highlight stuff and you can make a note. So I wrote in my note, the author seems guilty of this in this book, based on what I just said. Accusing divorcees, this is what y'all doing. Y'all just gave up and quit and then had the nerve to find something else to do. That you didn't even try to understand the situation of those, for instance, who have dealt with mistreatment and abuse within their marriages. Not at all. But those of us who left, and it's not good. It's not a good look. It's not a good look for the book. So for me, that was a huge turnoff for me. So it was one of those books at the end of the day they said, there's a saying, chew up the meat, spit out the bones. There were some good points, I'm going to admit that. Like, for instance, chapter 13, or rather chapter 8 for me, was be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That was my favorite chapter out of the whole book. Done very well. This chapter 4 that I just talked about, what he made about this comment about divorce and stuff and simplified it, was my least favorite chapter. Chapter 11, where he talked about marrying young so you can build together, where he was very positive and about young people, but he was very negative about older people, which I thought was interesting because he's now in an older category. He's married now, but yeah, he's still in the older category. So it's like, does it mean the rest of us who are older, we're screwed? I don't know. I didn't get it. I thought that chapter, it felt for me like it was thrown in. One thing I thought that it needed was some more research, definitely some research there. If nothing else, and in the divorce chapter, that well, not the divorce chapter, but the chapter 4, he would have needed to have put some more research in there. Even if he put something from the Dear Future Wifey podcast, I would have appreciated that. But there was nothing from any of the podcasts that he put in that section where he had those comments about divorce. No Dear Future Wifey references, no research references. So in my opinion, that section need to be reworked. The section about marrying young, the benefits of that over being older, and what he was putting out older people a lot, in my view. That needed some research. They needed some more, some more work in the research department. And there was another section regarding his one of his final chapters was about sex, which I get about asking questions about sexual views prior to marriage, because he didn't want to make the mistake that he made the first time with his first wife, and I get that. So, but I would have loved to see more research in that chapter as well. That overall was my critique. I would probably, out of a 5-star rating, give it like 3 stars. Based on what I've just said, there were some good points I really appreciated, but it was not really solid and strong for me like it could be. It kind of worked against himself, and it's almost, I feel like he's not as comfortable with this story about having been unfaithful in his prior marriage and whatnot. I'm not saying he's going to be like that in his present marriage. I know he's recently gotten remarried, so I'm not saying he's going to be like that, but it seems like he hasn't really settled himself with what happened in his prior marriage, and you can kind of tell it in the book based on my reading, because it's like all this deflecting, condescending speech to the reader, and though it's not all over the book, which I would say that's a good thing, the fact that it's there at all is off-putting, and it would make somebody just want to guess again about wanting to proceed with reading the entire book. And that's not what you want to do when you want to promote love in your lessons. This is your opportunity to shine and help a multitude of people in the process. So I'm a person who believes in I see the good in folks first before I see the bad in them. So I actually believe he's capable of doing better in those sections that I just mentioned. And I'll be open to doing a new review based on the book being reworked in those areas. Like, I wouldn't mind at all, because I know there's potential for it to be a lot better than it is in those particular areas that I was talking about. So that's my review. I hope you were able to gain something valuable from that, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.